Thank you.
It's good that you have.
Thank you.
Get the grade.
Okay. So if the sound is good, everybody can see, so perhaps we can start. So it is my absolute pleasure and honor to host this meeting on behalf of the Global Development Studies at the Faculty of Social Science, University of Helsinki. And we have been gained this possibility through somebody very special who has helped to organize it. So I am actually going to be just more moderating at this point, and I am going to give the floor to Linda Ovsilova, who we owe this pleasure. So Linda has helped to organize this event, and I am very grateful on behalf of our whole staff and the faculty and the university. So Linda, welcome.
Thank you. Hello everyone, my name is Linda Ovsilova, and first thank you Tina for organizing this on behalf of the university and providing us with this space and doing everything that you have done. And I just wanted to give like a short background on how this all came about. So when I was in Nepal, I was studying Nepali language there, and I met some Dalit rights activists there in Kathmandu. And I remember like one meeting, we were like in a room and listening to like a record tapes for a radio, like from 30 years ago, where people were talking on the radio about like the atrocities against Dalits, and they also like composed songs, like protest songs, and we were sitting there in the room and listening to these records, and I just remember like a very welcoming feeling at the time. And I also remember the main message of the meeting, which was like kind of like we are all human beings and like every human deserves to be treated with dignity, and one doesn't like, it should not be radical to say that, but sometimes it seems that it is. But anyway, so after that, I have been following like Dr. Suratinga's work for some time, but I didn't think like it's possible to like have him in Finland or like anything like that. I couldn't even imagine. But then eventually I got encouraged by another Dalit rights activist and the co-founder of Dalit Lives Matter Global Alliance, Radek Pariat, who introduced us virtually. And I was thinking that the topic of caste has been especially silent in the Finnish context, and still we feel it's like our responsibility to learn from the struggles around the world and to support movements for dignity and liberation. And especially to support these movements at their own terms, without like the type of constant need for like a top-down, know-it-all approach that we white people love to practice. And so that's why I was hoping to invite like an expert on the topic to educate us on it. And secondly, I'm also hopeful that we can try to learn something from today's talk, which we could also apply here on our own affairs in Finland. Since according to a study from 2018, Finland was found the most racist country among 12 European countries that were there. And we have a dark history of colonizing the Sami people, and with the uprising of the right-wing parties, many people of color from non-dominant backgrounds can feel the impact of racism in here. Okay, so now let me introduce, please fill in if I forget anything. So Dr. Suraj Jengde is an Indian scholar and a Dalit rights activist known for his work on caste and race, and he is an incoming assistant professor of history and African studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and has previously worked as a W.E.B. Du Bois Research Fellow at Harvard University, and he has obtained his doctorate degrees from the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, and from the University of Oxford. And the second doctorate traced the global history of caste and race through the Dalit and Black intellectual thought. And he's also involved in building solidarities between Dalit, Black, Roma, Indigenous, Buraku, and refugee peoples. And in addition to the book that we are having today, he has also written this other book, which was a bestseller, The Caste Matters, which I also recommend everyone to big. Anyway, but today we are talking about this, another book, Caste A Global Story, and please, I would like to invite you to start talking. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Oh, grateful for your coming.
Thank you very much.
I was wondering if the background, can we just,
Yeah.
and then maybe, if you could use maybe
So thank you, everybody, for coming. I was almost going to say thank you for coming this night, but it's an afternoon in Finland. So I'm really honored and excited to be amidst you all. And also, I really want to, it's my first trip. I was in Estonia this summer. I was doing a Baltic research trip. I was visiting a few sites from Warsaw onwards. And I was in Estonia. I was in Tallinn, and people were saying you should go to Finland. And I also agreed, but I just didn't take the next step. Somehow I knew it's gonna work something out, and I did not know it was gonna work something out so soon. I just happened to be on the continent. I was in the UK and then doing several book launch events, and then I get an email to say if you would like to come to Finland. And I did not know what the schedule was like, but I just said, let's just decide. But then we were all excited to say, okay, let's do it. And that let's do it took some time. But I'm telling you, this is really one of the record events that we did in a long time. This is something organized in under 3 weeks' time, advertised in under 10 days' time. So let's give it up to Linda Ovshilova, who really put her efforts behind, and she's the reason that she thought we could pull it off together. So thank you. Let's give it up to Linda for her. Thank you. We were all very excited to be here, and also to Tina for catering this space. This is we don't do this. University events have to have at least a semester notice in advance. Even if you hire to do it, it's difficult. So I'm really honored. And what a beautiful sight to have. There's a Christmas market here. There's that Lutheran church, and it feels special. And being with you this afternoon is also very special. I would like to also give a shout out to a few people who I know. My dear friend Kavita Pillai is here, who has done this amazing story. We've been friends for long. And thank you. She happens to be here doing these things. And so thank you also Kavita, who also happens to be my host, alongside her very engaging puppy who speaks in the Pillai dialect. Thank you also to Arto, activist here, who's been a kind Helsinki docent to me, taking around places and learning a few things about this place, and also to Praful, Deepika, and Nirmiti. Thank you also, Angad has come a student here. He was like very much following me to say, why don't you come to Finland? I'm like, man, come on, man, I'll do it sometime. But then when things happen, things really happen very well. And so thank you everybody for being here. We also have a guest from London who I say, you want to come? He said, okay, let's go. And then he's going to have his own itinerary. So there's so many thank yous, but also importantly, I hope to have known many of you at the end of this. The topic, I think, the first thing I think we should understand is the topic of caste. I think it's one of the reasons we should know about it and have concern about it is because caste we should not really look at as a concept that is out there in a distant land, out there in this oriental geography called India, out there in somewhere kind of a different place. It is something that we ought to understand how society organizes itself. Now I was looking at comparative history. I was doing a little bit of my own short historical reading of Finnish society, and it was amazing that the two different societies, obviously distinct in its own purview, very much modern in its identity. India, on the other hand, really gets a very complicated position in the sense of we don't know what to make of caste. So, and not just India, you go to Nepal, Nepal is gripped with caste. And you go to Pakistan or Sri Lanka for that matter, or Bangladesh, South Asia. And then you go to East Asia, and then you have within South Korean society, nowadays apparently it's abolished, but in Japan, there is a caste system. You go to Africa, there is a caste system. So in many ways, we look at caste as a society that organizes according to birth-based identities into a strict hierarchy. Where there is really an escape for you from this hierarchy. You are born into a caste. And there's very little for you to escape out of it. And even if you may work out of this system, which is, let's say, you become someone who has certain economic incentives, for example, or in American parlance, they call passing in the Indian caste context or global caste context, it becomes a disguised promotion. And so these ideas really manifest itself to register one as someone doesn't belong to a community. Now here's the thing. Caste works in a very relative way. It is not an isolationist institution. You only get recognition in a caste system if there is someone else who is claiming a different position. If there's nobody else claiming a different position, then there's no way to have a caste, because you can't really have this echo coming back to you. So somebody definitely benefits out of it, and somebody certainly is disadvantaged out of this caste system. And so we really need to kind of investigate what does that privilege brings to the system of caste, and how the institution organizes itself on the principles of hierarchy. And so, having placed this kind of theoretical framing, let's look at how caste organizes. In India, this has been an historical Brahminical Hindu caste system, where you take a birth, you're assigned a caste, because the womb that you are taking the birth through is either a sin or somebody that's blessed womb. Oftentimes, the womb is the deciding agent of the person's identity. Now, the carrier of that womb may not be as precious as what comes out of that. Simply put, your identity is already decided. It's already decided when you're conceived, it's already decided even before there is procreation. And this is something that continues with you. It's so sticky that no matter what you do, oftentimes it comes back haunting. And you can't really escape it as is. And even though you escape it, it may come across in your day-to-day interactions, relations, your family, your relatives, the kind of food you eat. Now, granted that you may compromise on these things. Maybe, there's a famous story, especially in the Dalit literature, where a Dalit writer writes, gets a job. First generation gets a job. And when he gets a job, he goes to an urban center. Now, when you go to urban center, you don't have a house, so what you do is you rent. Now, renting an apartment itself is an exercise of how modern caste manifests itself without any intense scrutiny. So when you're renting, one of the first things, the person who's renting out the apartment, and by the way, the people who rent out the apartments are people who have already gone to the urban centers. Majority of India still is rural. And of that rural, majority of them are Dalits, or the people from what we call the backward classes. And so, when you go to urban center, one of the first questions they ask is, okay, what's your name? And then you may give your first name. What's your father's name? Then, that isn't written there. What's your last name? And now, in this negotiation, what you're essentially doing is, why you're not offering the first name, but not offering second name, is to not just give away clues to second name. Oftentimes, your first name itself indicates more or less if you're smart enough to pick up. If that doesn't, what's your father's name? Now, if your father's name is something Kumar, which is like normal or Singh, and it doesn't make sense, tell us your last name, what it is. And then when you describe your last name, and that's when you can really say, okay, A, B, C, okay, now this formula works. Maybe I can understand the caste of this person. Now, even though if you don't understand this, the fourth question is obviously, what's your caste? Or it may go in a much more pedantic way to say, where do you come from? Where's your village? Or what your parents do? These are a series of questions. It's not trying to know you as a person, it's just to establish what is your caste. But nowadays, or in many areas, as metropolitan as Bangalore, there's a research there done by Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore, where the zones are coded according to your caste. So if you look at Indian society and if you look at urban infrastructure, it is zoned according to the caste system. And if the urban architecture or the disciplines of urban geography doesn't talk about it, that's a huge lacuna in itself, investigating how a society constitutes itself. So there is a designated, what we call Dalit neighborhood. There's also a designated Muslim neighborhood. There's a designated Brahmin neighborhood. There's designated different kinds of neighborhood. And so people have gathered around each other through this enclave of societies that is usually community oriented. Now what happens when you have towers? We don't have these houses spread around. When you have this building complex in societies, even there, then, if you have to rent, you really ought to belong to that community or caste, because the people who are responsible to manage the affairs of this building and stuff like that are manned by people who belong to a certain caste. And so when this author goes to urban area, gets the apartment, the first question is asked, what's your caste? And he hides it. He's like, I'm not risking it, I like this house and whatever. So he doesn't give his caste. And so he's hiding. He's literally hiding, and the way he's hiding is, he's not demonstrating that will give a clue to his caste by not worshipping the gods he usually worships, because hey, how come you worship that god? Because we thought, because gods are also segregated by castes. Or, the most important thing, which is where he gives away his caste, is the kind of food he eats. And so, he times it when his landlord goes to a Sunday temple. And in that 2.5 hours of his landlord going away, he cooks beef, because that's his loving meat. That's what Dalits usually eat. So he starts cooking, and one day, all hell breaks loose. He doesn't go, and he has to eat. And so finally he cooks. And then he explains how the waft of the beef, which is very strong, that comes out of kitchen, he tries every other way for the smoke to not go, rather the smell to not go into the apartment that belongs to his landlord. So he's navigating all that surface so that smell doesn't penetrate his consciousness. The olfactory senses are also policed in this caste system. And so he then finally, of course, it is exposed, and then he's like, I was caught while cheating and lying. That's how intense you realize caste becomes, and that's how personalized it endows a responsibility on people who are trying to maintain their place in the caste system. So caste in this sense really performs a duty of policing an entire community on the actions decided by the people who are privileging out of caste system. And it's obvious, if you are benefiting out of this, you ought to maintain a strict control on it. You can't have democracy running amok, because then what will we do of this institution that is so built on animosities of each other? There is an antagonism that works, and that's why India, Dr. Ambedkar, whose photo we have here, was talking about India has a coded nations based on caste. So it's a very difficult cartography. And of course, you cross over to Nepal. Again, there are several regions from north to south, and you can see the hierarchy playing it out well when it comes to accessing basic resources. Even today, a Dalit person has to negotiate by their life to access clean water. And this is something that remains bane for our society. Imagine a woman not having access to reproductive health just because she happens to be a woman from a lower caste community, an oppressed community. That's the only reason. The facilities are there. It's not like it is not there. But yet, if she is from a tribal community, she doesn't have access to that, because she is still a sin-polluted body. So either a person of her caste, who is a doctor or some nurse, has to attend to her, or she's on her own. And these are the cases you generally see in rural as well as now frighteningly in urban areas. That's how caste maintains itself. And there is no way for one to defy the norms. If you defy, as we call it, disguised promotion, you're still caught up in one or the other way when it comes to your caste identities. To give an example, in India we have a very robust, one of the most active, engaging constitutional principle of uplifting people who are from the marginalized outcast communities. We call them reservations. These are quotas. This is constitutional mandate for anybody to have access to government resources. And now that's the result. You get your percentage, you are whatever 16, 17%, you get that quota. And yet, to even access that basic, that starts with education, you don't get access to that. Because most of the institutions have been manned by people who really want to have a tight control. And they do that by injecting inferiority into the mind of a person who is born into a certain caste and community. Imagine if you grew up in a society where you have been taunted from childhood for belonging to the community that is disgusted, that is looked down upon, that's frowned. And when a child notices that, the child doesn't want to associate with that identity, no matter what. And the way they do it also by policing what you eat in your lunchbox. I, for example, we eat meat. I don't remember, barring 1 or 2 times, I ever took meat to my school, because that would just be too embarrassing. Why? Because the friends who I would eat the food with would really disassociate because I happen to eat meat. This is the kind of sacred protocol that registers into the mind of a young child. A young child who really wants to eat nutritious food is deprived of that because the caste control happens in such a way that this minority community, Brahmins in India, are dominating classes who are only 3 to 3.5% of population. Yet they have access to more than 60% of national wealth that is produced by the majority of classes. And then if you look at the bureaucracy, if you look at the institutions of academia, if you look at judiciary, the major arms, and if you look at politics, major political parties are also, it's very ironic, are run by the single group, Brahmins, or their subordinate, what we call higher castes. So you may have a person belonging to whatever caste, the parent organization is again controlled singularly by this Brahmin group. And Brahmins, we see, are also in opposition to the same party. So we all have democracy hijacked by this minority community. Whereas the rest of the subalterns who are now breaking through and coming out in democracy, they are looked down upon. In fact, the entire media scape points them out for being inefficient, for being somebody who cannot rule. Does that argument sound familiar in the context of, let's say, France having its colony in somewhere in West Africa, or Britain having its colony somewhere else, to say we can't leave because we want to make sure that you are able to govern yourself well? Well, the situation is not that different. The patron as well as the clientele relationship exists in the post-colonial context. That's why much of our understanding, our academic approach to it, has been very sadly undermined by our own hegemonic ideas of looking at the world. Post-colonial scholarship did a great disservice where the Brahmins of India became the protectors of post-colonialism by undermining the subaltern resistance not as a caste struggle, but calling it as a neutral class peasant struggle. And when you misidentify, you really eliminate the discourses that come out of people who are oppressed by caste. And that's what happened when an entire generation of post-colonial canon that was created by this group who created subaltern scholarship, a great postmodernist writing, nevertheless did a disservice to an entire community who is fighting the resistance of Brahminical dominance for more than 2,000 recorded years of history. And when we do that, we really say to people that doesn't matter how much radical I am, it doesn't matter how much equality I think of, I will still be out there protecting my kith and kin. Because caste is thicker than any form of blood that you may have. It is rooted in your consciousness. You may defy a caste system, but you will still protect your caste people. And this happens in the community which it sees itself as dominating. The subalterns are still trying to catch up. The outcasts are still trying to emulate. The famous French idea that was produced by Gabriel Tarde in 19th century, idea of imitation. Imitation in this sense of people who are lower always trying to imitate. Like for example, the institution of marriage. It was never meant for people to marry as having this celebratory idea. Marriage was usually within the peasant context. You went under a tree or whatever, you have like 10 people, you married each other, and then you had a family. But when you looked at the royal presentation of marriage, the other aspiring class started to emulate that. So imitation works in many ways. I mean, if somebody here is using some fancy phone and that person happens to be influential, you think, I want to have. That's how advertising industry works. We all depend on the parallels of imitation. Society mindset is created to imitate what is good out there. But here in this sense, the imitation doesn't really replicate itself because imitation requires a sense of familiarity. The Brahminical caste system is so sequestered, it has its own COVID-like pandemic rituals around it. It's like a barbed wire that Ambedkar talks about. You really need to go through the barbed wire. You need to pierce through the skin, through those wires running through your veins, and then only you can come on the other side. People don't want to risk that. And that's how we see caste becoming an uber institution that self-regulates. You don't need an outside person to regulate. You don't need a regimen. The system is so ingrained that it self-regulates. You don't have to belong to a higher caste to practice caste. You don't have to belong to middle caste to practice caste. You belong to any range of higher to lower. You self-discipline in that caste because you are taught if you have to cross the house of a person who is a landlord, you are taught to remove your shoes. But it's natural. You go to South India, Tamil Nadu, or other regions, you remove your footwear and you have to walk. If you are taught to not have an institution that will challenge the caste system, you will continue to emulate. Why do we do that? Because there's no other option for you to establish your humanity because the institutions of power are held by a group. So even though we have a democracy, it's still hijacked. So it's very few ways we can see this kind of escapable system in our sight. And that's what we see caste system really coming out in its droves. And that system is then seen across the world. So we have to really understand. And so development sector, for example, we have to take into consideration pathetic understanding of the world has gripped the development economists, for example. One of my mentors is development economist at Harvard. Their understanding of the world is very much skewed with how much of economic metrics can this community have when it comes to relation of their production. A very old, tired Marxian idea of what production means in the sense of an outcome. Today we are living in a new liberal era, and yet that old canal of identifying, rather misidentifying the problem has created a regulatory standards, and that's why when this aid agencies and development sector is going down, we are not crying. Because that agenda was always meant to find itself fixated because the agents who are trying to implement the ideas of development are themselves plagued by the superiority of caste. And there's very few examples we see, and so unless we count it out and point it out, we really don't get to the next extreme of this. That's why when we see various struggles culturally looking at the caste system, caste operates in culture. One is how you interact with the other community people. Is there a harmony? There isn't. You rarely interact with a person from a other caste without having a sense of discomfort. If you're from a Dalit community, you can't have a conversation of equal parlance because there is very few things that the other non-Dalit maybe relate to you. Because it's often we, or rather I, have to adjust into what they think of me. So they've already decided this is what you should do. and there are few codes, and if I'm defying that, I'm not the right kind of person. So I have to be very humble, subservient, following the protocols, paying my obeisance, and not rebelling. Now if I do any of that, which is to claim for my rights, fight for equality, be part of the democracy, have an engaging dialogue, that's not accepted. Basic human values of any liberal democracy are scorned in a caste society. And that's why many Dalits opt out. And the system that is ought to represent itself as a model. And that's why we have always had a wrong image of a caste society. The caste society is always assumed as something that has been a relic of the past. There was a whole system. Its everyday experiences are so intense that in my hometown, a girl who belonged to a slightly higher caste and a boy who was a Dalit, young people met each other, loved each other. What's so scandalous about it? They loved each other. And the boy was charismatic, and the parents were at first like, let's try to figure this out. So they establish a relationship. Because the girl doesn't want to give up on this boy. The parents are dissuading her. Don't be in love with this. They create all kinds of Indian parents are one of the enigmatic police who inflict harm upon their own kind just to maintain the sanctity of the caste system. And if you ask them any rationale behind it, they don't have it. Indian parentage is certainly a hindering block to liberate people out of caste system. And so this parents and the entire family participates in discouraging their younger child, their daughter, to not be in relationship with this person. She doesn't accept it. Now the parents give up. And so they say, okay, fine, we can accept it. Now this boy becomes part of the family, friends and stuff like that. And they're in a relationship for 3 years. And they come to each other's house, they're having, they're participating in certain rituals, and then they decided to marry. Just before deciding to marry, he's invited to the girl's child house. So he goes as his potential in-laws. They shoot him. Bullets are lodged in his body, and he's still not dead. So they pick up heavy stones and smash on his head. Brutal death is being witnessed by who? By his wife, their own daughter. The parents are heavily invested in maintaining the period of caste system that a Dalit body has to be slain. And this incident happened just last week. Saksham Tate was his name, in my hometown, not far from where I live. This is the present day reality. Very few escape. And many a times in India, you may have heard this idea, and I'm seeing this happening in other societies as well. Concept of arranged marriage. Arranged marriage in India is a caste marriage. It's basically marrying within your own subcaste. Parents try to find somebody who is suitable within your subcaste. And this happens across the board. Not one caste is responsible. And then there is another marriage called love marriage. So love marriage represents freedom from caste. It really is a representation of what a caste-free world will look like, which is love. But this society is so hateful, it hates itself so much that it is willing to sacrifice its own children for the maintenance of the caste system. And we see this regulated across the board. That's why when we hear certain cultural ideas of eating the food, simple as gastronomy, what you eat, it itself is heavily caste policed. Like the example I give of this Dalit author who wrote this story, we have the unholy divide between vegetarian and non-vegetarian. I have a friend who is a Dalit scholar. He says, why do you want to distinguish? Why do you want to say non-veg? Why don't you say meat eaters and non-meat eaters? Because he says, what you do by being vegetarian provenance is saying vegetarians that you are the special people, and we happen to be non-special people. Even the palate that you put in you is heavily culturally policed based on caste principles. It's so simple. Why? Because it's just not vegetarian versus non-vegetarian. It is pure vegetarian versus impure non-vegetarian. Purity is one of the pillars of a caste society. Nothing wrong in having vegetarian and non-vegetarian, or meat eaters and non-meat eaters. But why do you have to have a purity to that? Because there's got to be a Brahminical notion. A Brahmin has to be a chef who is making this with God knows what kind of mantra that he's drawing from. And that purity has to come into this place. And you see that in restaurants, not just in India, but outside India. This is as simple as one can see, but a huge cultural war is going on between that two labels. And oftentimes, growing up, or even now, if somebody is vegetarian, I hesitate to tell them I'm a non-vegetarian. Because I feel a sense of guilt and responsibility because he may out me out that, oh, you are one of those lower castes. So, do you have vegetarian food? Absolutely. Very rarely do we see when meat eaters invite their non-meat eater friends accommodating. No, not accommodating them. If I'm a meat eater, you say vegetarian, you want to come over, I'll cook your food. Does that happen vice versa? I'm a meat eater, I'm going to vegetarian persons, I'm talking about Indians or the caste people. There are many people who may have gone to India, many people who are Indians here or Nepalis here. If you go to your friend who is from a dominant oppressor caste, who invites you over for a dinner or lunch, and you say, I'm a meat eater, will they accommodate to your palate? Has your ever dominant caste friend cooked meat for you? Or at least made an attempt to say, I don't know how to cook, let me order it for you. The impurity of the meat might defile the household. That's what it is. It's not just about eating. That's how we see the wars between these big communities are taking place. And today this is the bigger war. In this so-called Hindu nationalist India, the central politics that Modi government started was around the sacredness of bovine, a cow. This is how they captured the attention. Now the problem is, even among Brahmins, there are certain Brahmins, especially in East India, who consume meat. But the central, especially northern Indian dominance has created such a suffocating environment that this cultural politics animates itself. And by the way, when they started to create this nuisance of cow as a sacred animal, the people from outcaste were saying, why is buffalo not a sacred animal? Cow gives milk, so does buffalo. Majority of India lives on buffalo's milk. It's thick, it's fatty. But why is only cow the sacred? Why is this dark-skinned buffalo not given the same sacred status? This is where we see the supremacy of caste logic playing, where a dominance of what is assumed to be sacred is only equated to an animal, whereas the people who are tending that animal are lower than that animal. The beef industry is dominated by two groups. One are the violent vegetarian groups called the Jains. Pathetic that they have sued so many organizations across the world, extorting them for their violent vegetarianism. Nothing wrong in vegetarianism, but the violence that comes with it is the purity idea. And second are Brahmins. And some Muslims who are from the dominant caste Muslims. Even Muslims have a very strict, rigidified caste system in India. No religion in India can claim to have escaped the caste. Christians have their own churches. Muslims also have their own institutions, and the endogamous nature doesn't work. The exogamous nature doesn't work. And so does the Hindus and so forth. Here we see when culture is plotted as a nationalist idea, there is always one caste that is winning. So when you say Hindu nationalism, it's a misnomer. It's not a correct definition. It doesn't capture the nuance. Who is a Hindu in India? Hindu is a colonial construct. There was no such thing as a Hindu in the past. They were called Brahminica. Hindu was a lazy identity imposed by the colonial ethnographers as early as 1860s and 70s. Hindu, of course, the way people from Europe and other ways were coming as missionaries, they saw this group as a religious category, as a social category. Because the missionaries, Jesuits and so forth from Iberia, Portugal, Spain and so forth, who were coming. Not as much Spain, but Portugal, Amsterdam, France, England, when they were coming to this part of the world, they were looking at it as a social category, which eventually, of course, becomes religious. So when somebody says, I'm a Hindu, it doesn't make sense. Because Hindu cosmology has to stand on a foundation of caste. Without caste, you cannot be a Hindu. Because Hindu as an identity is tied to a sectarian notion of Hinduism. That's why we have so many varieties of Hindus in India. There's no singular variety that operates here. And for us to understand this, we have to look at where does this blasphemous notion of Hindu nationalism come from? Because this has become really sacred for certain groups of people, when you cannot really, when you cannot break it, because it is tied to idea of India. It doesn't exist. This is a new forcible push by dominant caste groups to create a new politics that will be defined as a precursor based on Hindu nationalism. That's why you have to break this idea. You cannot have the notion of resistance based on Hindu nationalism. It doesn't exist. Why? Because the majority of Hindus are from the subaltern caste groups. They are not the dominant caste groups that are drawing benefit out of it. These are the people who are everyday workers, peasants, working class people, people from various kinds of castes, who are going about doing their jobs, who have their own gods, who have their own culture, who have their own tradition, bereft, different from the Brahmins. Yet Brahmins use that identity to misrepresent an entire group of people, calling them Hindus, and yet the victims doesn't become a Brahmin, but the victim is always the lower caste, always the subaltern, who's trying to create a sense of self in a modernized democratic republic India. And for you to have a republic identity, you cannot have a caste identity, you have to have a religious identity, and thus you are forced into identifying either as Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Buddhist and so forth. The modern religious categories that we know are insufficient to capture the nationalist grains of each community. That's why we have to be very sensitive when we identify groups of people into a nation state. Nation state is still very modern. People are yet to use to it. If you go and ask the indigenous people, their idea of nation state is extremely different than the way we see as a liberal democracy, as giving rights. In this context, it's very much individual centered. And where caste communities are individually siloed, you cannot have an engaging democracy in our life. So Hindu nationalism, the way we see critique, we have to go and ask about the bigger elephant in the making of Hindu nationalism, which is what does caste do? But these people have excelled in misdirecting the attention from the caste question and calling it a Hindu versus Muslim question. Hindu versus Muslim cannot exist without the victim from the Muslim caste and the victim from the Hindu caste. And these are the people who belong to the subaltern caste. They are not the dominant caste people. Unless and until we have this refined understanding, we really reproduce a bad reading of fascism and toxic nationalism anywhere in the world. And so it is a lesson for the rest of the world to look at the granular details of what constitutes a authoritarian society. It is not just this political impulse of majoritarianism. It is part of it, but there is much more that is going on. Why are the subalterns participating in an authoritarian idea of fascism? Unless and until we go to the graves of that, we may not be able to fully comprehend the picture. And for us to realize that, it cannot work on the logic of nation-based race. How can a Brahmin person who is believing in the supremacy of self by performing certain rituals every day or praying to a certain god, essentially when you do that, it's not just purely spiritual practice. You are remembering the old age episodes of reminding yourself that this is this Vedic caste system and you are somebody who belongs to this group. You happen to be a person from this community. Why? Because there are majority people who are not belonging to your community. There is no equality in the system. And if it's premised on equality, how can we have a communication that derives from the notion of one's inferiority? An inferior person cannot claim a position of equality as much as a person who is superior. What I mean by that is a person is already suppressed by the superior people who are thinking themselves as superior will never give a chance to the person who belongs to the subaltern communities. And so when migration happened outside India, there were two types of migration that happened. One during colonial times and one post-60s onwards, that we saw modern migration to the Western world. The first migration was migration of the outcasts, indentured laborers. The slavery system that was created by, again, the outcasts of West African society was replaced by the outcasts of Indian society. And they are the ones who created modern colonies across the world who were part of the empire. They were the peasants, they were your workers who were going and toiling and creating countries in Caribbean. And then there is another migration that happens, which is usually considered the migration of the dominant castes. And this group of people are someone who are dominating. And these are the people who continue to emulate a position of certain racialized ethnic background. We have to go much more detail. If you say he is Indian or she is Indian, it is incomplete. Because this is not a monolithic society. Nearly 24,000 separate independent caste groups exist. How can you call this a monolithic representation of a group? And each caste group is not in harmony with the other. There are conflicting measures happening. They are not peacefully sharing meals. They are segregated depending on their neighborhoods. This is the reality. And the most refusal that comes against the caste system are the ones who are most oppressed, the Dalits. And that's why people want to read out the system. The people who are in the middle ranks and above want to be complicit in the system because they don't see themselves as seeing free, because they also benefit somebody is lower than them. Doesn't matter somebody is higher than them, I'm happy somebody is there who is lower than them. And this entire infrastructure constitutes the way land policies and relations are designed. So you can't have a revolution without having the complicity of the people who are from the outcast. But what happened in the revolution was dominant caste people hijacked the whole idea of revolution. And the migration that we see happening across the world, in many parts of the world, we ought to have that definition. Finnish society is just 5.5 million. And yet, we see this resonating in many ways when you see about what equality stands for. It will be rebellious to a person who's grown up in a much more egalitarian society to see that your position, if you go to a different country like India and so forth, is pre-decided. You can't negotiate equality. There's no negotiation available. Either you have to commit what we call corporal suicide, or you have to rebel and just become one of the tyrants in the caste system. There's no middle way. Court cases and so forth are heaped. Yet there is no proper liberation in this system. We have to realize that there is something more sinister, and unless and until we address that question, it's only now. Ask yourself this question: why have there not been robust, engaging conversation on caste system? Why was there such an absence of an international dialogue? Nearly 350 million people are victims of caste system. Does that number register into a Finnish person's mind? 350 million. If you add another 200 million who are still lower, they are not upper, up to 550. But if you look at the majority who are lower castes, but not untouchable, yet victims of caste system, the number is 850 million people. 850 million people impacted by caste negatively. I write in my book, Caste Matters. In this, I point out that the beneficiaries of the caste systems are also part of the caste system. So if you look at India, essentially a constitutional republic, great idea. It's a thoughtful utopia that we try to emulate in every day. But the existential reality is you negotiate every day. And every person here who belongs to the Dalit community or not Dalit community have had experience of caste. And this happens when you go to a college or school and you're already tested if you are a person belonging from the reserved quota or not. Are you a meritorious person or not? Are you capable to be amidst us or not? This is not this refashioned idea. It is reintroduced in the way you do work. Just the other day I was on TV debating the same question, caste and quota. Even this idea is heavily debated in India. Any child who goes to school is trained to see yourself as lower. And yet, there is an entire community who wakes up early morning to carry the shit of India on their head. These are the lowest of the low. This is a given vocation. What we see unregulated, and I just wrote this article on civic sense. Nothing makes sense in India. Where can you have a civic sense when there is absence of civility? It's not a civil society if one caste dominates on the principle that they ought to do it because that's how they can gain their legitimacy. How can you gain your legitimacy by oppressing the other? Which democratic ethos talks or explains about? This is this oligarchy on a turbo mode, where you consider yourself as legitimate heir of this unequal, unjust society. And when we think about this, there is not, I'm saying 850 million people, right? And if you include the people who are also part of caste system, we are adding 1 billion people. 1 billion people, and there is no United Nations resolution on caste. That's how flawed this entire understanding of caste system is. Dalits have to rely on the oppression of black people, the Africans, the racialized minorities, to make themselves legible. This is the second-hand victimhood that this world has granted them. They cannot even exist on their own. You have to compare yourself as part of some other group. And that's why in this book that you will read eventually, there is the perpetuating ethos of what it means to have a Dalit and black solidarity. There's an entire history that's going on for some time. And that is something that I also do. When I started for my first PhD, I left UK, I went to South Africa. Because I wanted to see how the Africans are doing. What's up with them? New liberation movements. That's where I did my first PhD. I studied African societies, looking at the parallels, looking at the comparison. That's where you see that there are many more struggles that have yet to achieve the status that the people across the world have achieved. Because you see, race is a very easy and lazy way to formulate a policy. You say, okay, this is race, this is color, this is how it is based, and just design a policy. You don't go deep into the racialized castes of that community. So if it's an African who's benefiting out of race or victim of that, the person who gets access to it is from the dominant caste of that African society. It's not the poor peasant victim. If you go to Mali, for example, the subaltern caste, there is still servitude. Mauritania still has slavery. We don't go to investigate this, and it's our time. It's our time, friends and comrades, that we pay particular attention. We don't claim innocence about it. There was a time post-colonialism, anti-colonialism movement gave a rise to a certain genre. We tried to reformulate policies. We created much more development projects. We tried to understand about the world, and yet our solidarity is still tied to a nation-based politics. We still think of nationality-based activism as doing something better for the world, which is important. It is important. But nation cannot be representative of an entire communities who are not yet registered as part of the nation. Where do you put them? So we are excited to talk about Sudan. We're excited to talk about Gaza. We're excited to talk about this, and these are important concerns. But these concerns do not take us deeper into the problem. Nation state, as a modern bureaucracy, reproduces hierarchy when it has its own autonomy. And we have seen this happening. We have seen it happening everywhere. Post-colonial nation states have robbed its own citizens, and that's why we see struggles are still happening. India is still fighting for the rights of having good roads. This is the kind of politics that's happening. For good sanitation. We have to understand certain frameworks have its limitations, and those limitations have gathered around us. We have to register our understanding about them. And when we see it, we see that caste indeed is a playful instrument that is being deployed by the dominant caste of each society. This Caste A Global Story, you will read the world through a Dalit lens. This is the first time when the lens is on the outcast person who is casting a gaze in the world. To really understand what history teaches us about this. To really see, make sense of the world by one of the most oppressed communities. And that's why it's an appeal to different groups who are fighting for different kinds of solidarities and liberation movements to also come and learn what little the Dalits could have achieved. What is it about the civil rights and the liberation that remains unknown to us? They also have some things to teach to us. And these things are instrumental in our progressive politics of future, or else oftentimes we fight for certain things, and when it is achieved, what do we do next? We look for something else. Dalit struggle teaches us that we ought to be in harmony as we continue to practice liberation. And liberation cannot have a top-down approach. It always has to come from bottom up. And bottom up requires for a person from subaltern agency, from the Dalit, the outcast community, to have a primacy, a provenance in the way they look at the world. And this is where you will see that there is in Trinidad, in faraway island, I call it a Dalit Republic. Why is it a Dalit Republic? 19th century, majority of indentured workers were from the Dalit community. That's the National Archival record that you see there in Trinidad. These are modern republics of the outcast who went and found their own countries, but the Dalit consciousness in them continues to hinder. And that's why you see the global universal project for Dalit is cosmopolitan Dalit universalism. The Dalit universalism that we see betrays the idea of localized caste. If you are a person from certain caste, you are oppressed because the local structure punishes you. But the moment you escape that local structure, you really become accessible. But if you are in a small corner, you are in a small society, you are in a small community, you are in a small village, your caste is known and you are forced to act upon it. If you rebel against it, you are penalized. False cases are lost against you, and police and state system works against you. So what you do, you don't want to get through the hell. You just want to live your different life, so you just want to, you just escape that. But when you universalize yourself, there lies a certain remedy, a certain portion of justice, and that's where you will see caste acting as a global category that can evade much of the local thorns that are held against you. And that's why I think I invite you all to also study the Dalit struggle. To also study what it means to have a caste objective throughout the world. So this book looks at caste from 15 countries, across 15 countries, which is the ethnography I've done and archival work and lots of interviews with many people within the Ambedkarite struggle and so forth. There are nearly 250 Dalit organizations around the world. 250, and yet we claim our innocence about this community that we don't know. This is the invitation. Maybe after this, book, maybe you read, there won't be any more excuses for us to take into account and take into cognizance that there remains a vast humanity that has been resisting oppression, not just during colonial times, pre-colonial times, pre-medieval era, in the ancient era. And so you will read from what Greek authors wrote about caste, to colonial authors, to post-colonial authors, to current times. There is an entire story, and I hope that will also inspire you to continue the fight against resistance. Thank you very much. Jai Hind.
Wonderful. This was so inspiring and powerful speech that we have heard. I just posted to the online audience if they want to comment or share their thoughts. But I think we could start here in the live audience because we have a great number of people attending this event. Yes, please share your views and comments, questions. Your speech was so powerful that I think that it takes a while for people to settle with their feelings and thoughts. But yeah, I could start unless there's any questions at the moment. Yeah, I really like your perspectives on the liberation and inviting us all to learn and unlearn. So this is very important part. We at this neoliberal Western academy are often interested in many of the struggles, but then not end up doing much about it. So this invitation is really an important one. So how do we fight some of these issues within these structures that are not really enabling much of different ways of doing and reimagining or reconstructuring? So
that's really important. Thank you, Tina. I think the first thing is to have conversations like this to begin with, so we are much more aware and we are educated about the system. And also we don't have, and this is something when I was at Dartmouth, I went to give a lecture, Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. The students there came up, and they were Indian students from different castes, and they were like, we feel something about it. And I was like, why don't you learn something about it and have a student activism around this? Now see, here's the thing. Unlike other struggles that we are aware of, which is trying to get rid of the oppression because there is an ulterior state or state, here it is, the Dalits or the caste is part of the state now. So how do you create a nuanced activism about it? I mean, it's much more. And I think this is a creative apparatus of neoliberalism, that it has created much more refined categories to not go and attack against. We can say we are against colonization, and it makes sense because colonization country, we know we can sanction, and here it's very difficult. So I think we have to create more kind of perspectives around the world to really say, what are the problems that are lacking? I mean, there's one thing, why is certain issue becoming so dominant that we are unable to even comprehend this is the result, right? I mean, this is such a system, it has been talked about, there's so much written about, yet there is absolutely kind of almost absence about any conversation on caste. Or there are very few voices that represent the Dalit community, for example. I think that's where we could start, especially on these campuses, for example, have much more caste dialogues, facilitate maybe a caste symposium or a seminar, just to have this dialogue much more a day or two long, educate yourself, and maybe end of the day you will learn something, and it's the same way the people who are contributing may learn something in return, but at least have those people amidst you, learn more about it. And I really think the student and the youth activism or the university activism have to embrace these kind of anti-caste struggles. And the beauty of this is, it is not this secessionist movement, is not like anti-state, so to speak. It is much more refined according to this cultural idea where oppression continues. And that's why the Dalits are usually protesting against atrocities committed on them within the national framework. That's why there is no separate Dalit movement, so to speak, for separate nation or something. They are fighting within the same kind of idea of belonging. What we could do also is really, and I think this is something that one could think about, is to have a very particular approach to understanding not just India but other societies also within this. India cannot and should not have only a singular approach. Multiple societies are equally victims of caste in different societies. And something that once I go to Penn, which I'm going to do, is to inaugurate this kind of global caste dialogue. I wrote this paper a few years ago in a journal called Ethnic and Racial Studies, where I present a kind of a stab of what global caste really means. But to start, I think to begin with, let us not look at caste or caste in India as something that is distant. It is part of you. If you have Indian immigrants living in this country, it's a caste issue. That's it. And Indian immigrants are in 205 countries. That's what the Indian government website says. So that means wherever Indians have gone, there is a caste. So it should not look upon or look at as just Indian issue there in that geography. It's amidst us, and you can just go around Indian circles. The groups they have is the kind of festivals they celebrate. Festivals are again caste coded. It's not a common festival. And then look at who is dominating that organization, who is the Indian representative there, what kind of festivals happen. Is there a Dalit agency? Are Dalits celebrating the organization? And you're clear, this is horrendous. This is atrocious. I was in Dublin, and one Dalit man worked in a very good job. He was afraid among his Indian, and he was so afraid. Well read good books, but that confidence was not coming because the people who belong to dominant caste were not providing him enough agency to be him. So he was just trying to, I'm a Dalit and I'm going to offend you. So he was like trying to do both. I said, how can you do that? Because that's not gonna move the needle. We'll have to call out somebody. That's the problem. And he's like, no, we can't do that. And I asked him why. And then he says, there are much more social as well as professional difficulties he may face, which is the managers or people who are their supervisors are from the dominant caste. And within the Indian circle, they ask this casteist questions about, are you a person from this quota? There are various ways to ask. They will not ask you straight up your caste. Sometimes they do, but most often it's this hoodwink. It's creating this dog whistle around. Okay, let me just figure out. Okay, so what college did you go to? Okay, what batch, what score, what percentage? And that's what happened in the US. The Cisco case, where a Cisco giant was sued because this guy didn't give him a promotion, and allegedly that was the case. So you see that happening, and this guy doesn't want to call out. He's like, no, I have this professional barriers. So I say, does Ireland promote that kind of policy? He's like, no. I said, is there Equality Commission? Yeah. They said, go and sue them. Go and sue them, but they won't do it unless we have local Finnish people backing them to say, you know what, we don't tolerate this kind of injustice. We don't tolerate inequality. Allow us to support you in the way you can. And this is just professionals. I'm not even talking about personal groups and circles and how they, toil around. So, simply put, what I gave presentation today was around cultural dynamics. I didn't go around economics. I didn't talk about political aspects of it. I didn't talk about as much as this social endorsement, the social integration and social interaction that we don't see happening as much in caste system. That we can leave it for probably another time. But look at caste, not just confined to Indian groups in India, South Asian groups, anywhere in the world, there is caste.
Yes, I think I can come with this microphone to you. Here we go.
How is going to foul?
Okay, my name is Lotta. I would like to ask, you mentioned United Nations, but I didn't understand exactly what you told. I have read that there was a question of this caste discrimination. And then India said there that something like it's a family matter or something like that. I would like you to tell the truth that how is this UN reacting to caste discrimination?
That's Lotta.
Lotta.
Lotta. I will get the accent soon. Lotta, thank you for your question. And I think I deal with that question here in this book also. So I'm just coming to the point. So for example, if you look at Gaza and Israel, I think this was a long time ago, the General Assembly resolutions on this conflict that concerns significant people are I think more than 500 resolutions. And they are probably impacted like 10 million. Not to compare oppression with oppression, but just to say they're nearly for concerning 10 million people who are undergoing this violence within the Gaza belt. We have nearly 500 resolutions of General Assembly meeting in New York and passing, right, discussing. My point is there's not one General Assembly resolution condemning, let alone, I mean, even acknowledging caste system. Condemning is something that, they don't even, so the caste dialogue is often surrounding within these sub-bodies, because I worked in the UN, in the Human Rights Office many years ago, and this question was always one of those side committees and the special rapporteur and all of that, And the Indian government historically has been denying that. The Indian state is afraid of that. The Indian state doesn't want to engage because that will open and expose their own limits about handling caste atrocities. More than 50,000, this is a government record, atrocities, brutal atrocities are committed on Dalits each year. Now, 50,000 is a huge number. And yet, that doesn't get registered or echoed with as much a strict engagement. We had people died in some conflict, and if you think of this conflict happening each year, and 50,000 Dalits being dead, how does that register in your mind? 50,000 Dalits. We saw that conflict again in Middle East and so forth, and we count the numbers, like 50,000, 20,000, 40,000, and retrace. It happens every year, each year. These many atrocities are coming on people. And these are by the government records. You always know, government underreports. The government underreports it. It's usually 3 times more. But the numbers here say something significant. And in 2001 Durban conference, when the Dalits were trying to organize, the Indian government flatly refused. They say, this is not something we have a constitutional, it's an internal matter. We don't want to deal with this question. We have a constitution written by Dalit himself, so we are all fine. Let's not engage with that. And so they use this alibi to get themselves scot-free. They don't want to be held responsible against that. And so that's why the struggle is much more, that's why it needs much more engagement on a development politic front. And this has happened actually, especially now. There was one organization called International Commission for Dalit Rights. It's based out of Copenhagen. And they were trying to get a status called ECOSOC, Economic and Social Councils, where you can go and have a representation. For like 15 years, it was always refused. The Indian government would come in. Just last year, they got approval. I guess the government also gave it up, and what can we do, right? So even to have access, the Dalits don't have their own NGO. The ICDR is not Dalit run. So Dalits don't have their own outpost that can lobby with several international organizations. They have to rely on several friends and donors and partners, especially within this kind of Nordic complex, to get themselves known. I can't walk as a Dalit person into a Dalit organization and say, what, this is an issue, let me go. You will see every community have their lobbying group. And they have access to it. They can go and talk about it. But that doesn't happen with the Dalit community. They have to rely always on some partner organizations. So that really tells us how serious this problem is. The intensity of it is like this. And so we almost have to start from like some levels that have not been done.
No, thank you very much.
there's an online question, but I will take this microphone in the hall. So Ina, so if you can wait for a second. So we have one more question from the hall. So I'll come next to you, Ina.
Sure.
Hello, and thank you so much for your lecture or speech. I feel that I cannot really believe that you are here in Helsinki. My name is Mari Metso, and I'm actually from Dalit Solidarity Network from Finland. The website you can see on the background, and I'm also doing my PhD on middle class Dalit women. So I know that you have written about the issue in your previous book, but could you say something about this? What kind of problems related to solidarity creates this kind of situation where, for example, some women that I interviewed, they do not want to be called as Dalits.
Yeah.
So could you tell something about that?
I mean, it's a very dynamic community, and that's why I think, thank you, Mariam?
Yes, Mari.
Mari, thank you, Mari, and good luck, good work with the Dalit Solidarity. I think you have asked, so in my previous book, right here, I wrote about the Dalit middle class, and it was not a charitable view, and many kind of people felt betrayed, because I also provided a class perspective, and this is what's happening. And one of the strongest critiques I received from the Dalit community was specifically on that chapter, because the middle class doesn't want to be outed, because the middle class is still trying to become part of a state. Nothing wrong with that, and just get along, and they're like, why are you exposing us like that? And the question of Dalit, for example, is loaded. People have very much miseducation about this. People don't know what Dalit stands for. They it's a very rebellious category, but among the middle class Dalits, they have been miseducated and misinformed by the Brahminical media and education system that they don't acknowledge themselves as Dalits, as victims. They want to be part of a system. As I was saying, if the system is not supporting you, you become complicit in it, because that's the way you know how to be and run and go through. And so this middle class group that we see any part of the world is a very influential class. Majority of the laws are passed for middle class, by middle class. The democracy is usually middle class oriented, though it is hijacked by certain, kleptocratic kind of, people, and there's a whole formula around that, the billionaire democracy that we talk about, But in this sense, the middle class, to understand the Dalit question, we have to understand what a middle class means. There is no definition of middle class when it comes to a developing country like India. I was doing research, and hell no, there's so many numbers. Someone says middle class is this, someone is India. If you talk to anybody, they'll say I'm middle class. The have-nots and have-nots. How come you are middle class and I'm middle class? What's going on? That's why in my book I start with my mother, like I belong to below poverty line. So that's the kind of category which is less than $1 my parents made. So my upbringing of looking at society came from belonging to a slum where the sewer lines are open. Typhoid, malaria, it's an occurrence that almost 1% family has to have each year. The world is policed by state, and violence happens against the people who live in the slums, not necessarily against people who live in these societies. And then there is a discrepancy of how caste registers itself in middle class. So class is a primary reference point to understand any community. And once you have settled that, then we look at how institutions like caste become the add-on. But in Indian society, caste becomes the primary source of identity, and class becomes the secondary. So many middle class movement, for example, who said don't identify me as a Dalit, ask them what do you want to identify with. There's a huge debate, active, engaging debate about this as to what should we identify. And this is not the problem of Dalits, it's the problem of Brahminical caste system that has started with misidentifying them. In the earlier part of my lecture, I talked about misidentification. And that's when misidentity creates an identity crisis because you just don't know where you belong to. And many middle class Dalits are in identity crisis. They just don't want to register themselves as part of Dalits because the misidentity started from early on. Because you belong to a community that was condemned, that was looked down upon, that didn't have a status and dignity, and that even that happened with American black people. But how did they do that? Black people did something very significant in the 1960s and 70s. They supported the idea of black by calling it beautiful. Black became beautiful, and the whole genre of black is beautiful came. That was a revival, claiming strong agency, where black was considered darker, something more sinful, and they're like, hell no, we're not going to do that. The Dalit community is still yet to go through that process. And that's why with all the diversity, and black people could do it in America because there is almost, compared to India, they speak one language. India speaks so many languages. Each state, if you go to India, is different. It's its own world. I mean, I go to Karnataka and I'm like, what? I go to Kerala and I'm still like, what? Same happens with people. And yet, there is this pan-Indian system. So, Mari, your question is right. The Dalit movement don't want to identify. And the reason has to be with their primary confusion with the misidentification that has been occurred to them. And that misidentification occurs across the refugees and immigrant groups that you have in the society. It's the result of misidentification. You will not have a sense of confidence if your identity is not defined by your own rules. If somebody else gives you identity, you will always live in refusal of that identity. And that's the refusal you see happening with the middle class Dalits. But if you embrace yourself, which is going to take a groundswell, it's going to take a movement, then there is a much more revival around that. And therefore, if a child is said, as I said, you belong to this community which is lower, you're a person with a quota, you're a lower caste, the lower caste people are dirty, they are filthy, and blah, 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 you'll have that problem. And that's why that's the kind of, and they need to come kind of, out of it. And I think, some of this you will read within this context, at least in this book now, where there is much more Ambedkarite sense. And by the way, there are only a few copies, so I could only bring 10. So the 10 lucky ones will get it here with my signature on it.
I wonder if Ina, you would like to present your questions or comments next?
Yes. Thank you so much, Doctor. It was very, very eye-opening for me. I'm quite a beginner here and still learning. So thank you so much. There was a lot of learning in this session, in this speech. And as a background, I am currently working actually with an Indian origin company, and related to that, and I'm quite actively also part of the Indian community here in Finland. So related to that, I would like to hear your tips on how to be sensitive about this topic and how to not to enforce the caste system and perhaps be able to, as an outsider, I don't know if it's possible to break perhaps its effects in the work life, but also when navigating within the communities that the questions might be present there.
Thank you, Ina. I think this is a good question, and thank you for sticking online. I think it happens in every case. If you work with communities that you're not familiar with or you don't belong to, it's always good to study them and also be an enthusiastic participant. Nothing wrong in that, and obviously be in the service of the cause that you claim to stand for. Oftentimes, and it happens with people in activism, they don't serve, then they become somewhat of different than serving. And I think this could happen with anybody, and could happen with me, could happen with anybody. And I think it's always good to keep checking. And that's why I think we ought to, we have to extend that with a real purpose, right? Like, for example, Linda, she wanted me to come, and let me tell you, I was like, why? And she's like, usually when I travel, it's a whole shebang that goes with me. The whole office gets involved, it's this whole thing. But I saw somebody really interested in this, and I asked, and okay, let's do this. Somebody who is also willing to put their own resources, right? Which is such a fabulous thing to do, right? That is something we could bring to this dialogue, right? It's not just, let's say, as an outsider, and we always learn, but let us not carry the woke guilt of being an outsider. The wokeness is really damaged. It has created alternative fascism that we have right now. Let us really be liberal in our minds, and one can err. And there's always been this thing of wokeness that has also plagued the Dalit movement, and I write about it. It's quite. I gave a talk actually in Berlin 2 months ago at the HKW, the Culture Institute of Berlin, and the talk was woke fascism, and that's what I was trying to do. I was like, trying to break down how these new sensitivities have really deprived us of extending our true self in the service of a cause, because we had too many necessary, but I don't think those checks have to be at every level. If you pass a post of being valid, let's get into action. But we are sanitizing ourselves like we are in a pandemic at each level. And I think solidarity needs an action. And I think we can do that, Ina. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Hi, my name is Vibha. I'm from India. So I also speak a lot. I work in an IT organization here, and I speak a lot with my partner organizations about the fact that castes exist. And to an Indian, it's very visible. So when you look at an Indian person, you probably just see an Indian person just by knowing their name. I know where they're from, what their caste is, and a lot more. So the discrimination is much more visible than what it is. And I see a lot of Finnish organizations that take a lot of pride in the diversity, where in reality it is actually discrimination under diversity. So just kind of putting it out there. But my question to you, Suraj, is, you said that this is a South Asian problem. I always feel this is a Hindu problem, because no other religion actually puts caste in its literature. So do you see that as a Hindu problem, which is probably kind of has spread out to Islam with the Arzals and the Ashrafs, or do you still think that this is a global problem? Because that's the thing that happens all the time, that there's always that whataboutery, they're everywhere. There's an effort to generalize it.
I think, Vibha, I hear you, and thank you for flagging this. I think it's complicated, but it has to be truthful. I mean, liturgically, the hermeneutics of it is there, caste as a system. And many people use the defense that caste is this colonial creation. Now you have a thing that you can now use and almost use it as a brick, not to hurt someone, to defend yourself. No violence here. But when you notice that there are many defenders of caste system who say, it's just not Hindu, it's you see in every society, and one of the debate is it's a colonial construction. Yes and no. And they say there was a jati, and see, the moment when a person justifies an existence of a extremely pernicious, dreadful system, there's no dialogue there now. So we have to mature in our approach to that. When people are trying to nuance a murder of a person by saying, and this is what happens, social media now is replete with incidents of violence against Dalit people. You can just look up. You know what happens then? People respond to that by saying, this person was a criminal. Does that sound familiar? This person had so many records against him or her. This system has made the human sense get numb, almost dead-like, that even in the moments where you should embrace the empathy that comes in your sense and conscious, you deny that. You kill the human in you just to justify your dominance. How pathetic and how powerful at the same time this is. So yes, you're right, Viva, that is true, but that is also a fact that there are problems. So we should ask, okay, what do you mean by that now? Okay, if it's not just a Hindu, it's a Muslim and so forth. And your point being, is it good? Because that's what you're getting at now. Because you're saying, the sun doesn't set here, that means we are all equal. But then know that conversation after 2 or 3 points is going to require you a 2-hour of therapy session. Are you willing to undergo that? And this is unfortunate reality.
We have one question online and then at least 2 or 3 questions here in the hall. So I promised to Pekka Sarniola to ask this question on his behalf because he's on train. So he said that the speaker mentioned Marxism, social classes, and used the word comrade. So my question is if he feels that socialism in some form could alter the ongoing system in India.
What's the name of the person?
Pekka Sarniola.
Pekka, thank you for this question. Yes, most definitely. There's no doubt about it. But also, socialism cannot be a blanket ideology. It has to evolve and it has to adapt to the conditions that it's going to be acting in. Socialism by default, they themselves want socialism. It's where you're not special, separate, right? And the short answer is yes. There's no arguing against it. It has the value. Marxist values themselves are very potent, very vibrant. But this is what happens. Unfortunately, they tried to have many communists in India were and are Brahmins, especially the leaders. So their socialism was inspired by your neighbor, and they wanted to have this nationalist ethos of kind of socialism, communism. That didn't work because it's a very complicated society. And Dr. Ambedkar, he himself was a great admirer of socialism. In fact, his one of the powerful theses was called States and Minorities. It's about let's nationalize the land, let's nationalize the insurance, and let's nationalize the bank, and so forth. This is when he's writing at the eve of independence, right? And this is where the capitalist elites are afraid of, and we don't want this. And that's when he gets assimilated into writing a new constitution, when then he eventually says he was a hack. They asked him to write the constitution because he had these radical ideas. He didn't want to have, obviously later Dr. Ambedkar said, I was used because in a democracy, you need to have majority view, and majority is in India, he makes a very distinct difference. It's a communal majority. And communal majority is always working against the minority. And the minority here is by default categorized into a community. The way we understand community majority in other contexts, when we see majority as a political majority, here there is a layer, and in this case it becomes Hindu majority. So it's Hindu majority versus the rest of it. And that's how we see the rise of Hindu nationalism in present context.
So, thank you so much. My name is Hannele Kantel. I'm working as a teacher educator in this university, and I have I've been doing about 15 years collaboration with Asim Premji Foundation, Asim Premji University, non-profit, and I would say that within 1-2 years there has been like a growing interest. So many private schools, private institutes from India, they have contacted us, trying to get some like collaboration with us. And I think many Finnish education export people, they have now noticed that yes, there is a big money with doing that. And my question for you is that, because I'm very worried about this what is happening. So my question to you is that, is this education export kind of a way of supporting the caste system in India?
What's your name again?
Hannele Kantel.
Hanneleka Antel.
Yeah, that's my family name. Say Hannele.
Hannele.
Yeah.
Thank you, Hannele. And thank you for making it easy. This is a very important question. I think this will require us to meditate for a while. I'll give a very short answer, but I have a long answer. It has to come out of a policy dossier, because that's how we have to engage in this question. Right now, one private university vice chancellor came to my Harvard office. Good guy, I like him, many don't. And he said, what do you do? Come and work. And because I believe I'm part of a state system, I'm a product of state invested, I got a law degree in like 550 rupees or something. I believe my affiliation and my attachment and allegiance is to that. So, me personally, I don't deal with any private institutions in India. These are extremely competitive, or extremely expensive. And when it comes to money, either you have the Dalit so-called bourgeoisie, which is very tiny, which will be gone with just a thing, or there are this dominant caste. I don't want to legitimize them. That's my protest against them. However, we have to be pragmatic as well. But for me, so far, I hold on to that. I will, as long as I can, will never parlay with any private institution in India, as long as I can. Because that's where you dismantle the poorest. There will be no Surajende coming out of state schools if they are getting disenfranchised. And this is what they're doing. And they want to have this very problematic approach where the private institutions are owned by local feudal satraps. And feudalism is casteism with moral authority. And these people are these modern oligarchs who use their fiefdom, converted their historical privileges into commodities of neoliberal consumption, and made it saleable, where poor people can only dream of. And yet, they continue to have, and many of my friends come to my private schools, come to this, to do what? To do what? Many of them want to gain legitimacy. We want to give you an award. To hell with your award. I'm against this very idea of privatization. And they have done this very effectively. And these people are not contributing to the national development consciousness. So that's my critique of that. And I will continue to do that. And it has to happen. Especially if Finland has a state institution. Please don't perpetuate. If you have to make, it will be problematic to deal with Indian bureaucracy as well as everywhere else. But I will encourage you, don't deal with private organizations and institutions. It excludes people like us. They will have few token mementos, our Dalit or our tribal, but it is not the entire representation. Surajendra will still go like younger person to government institution. And they are dismantling that. And if you can, try to resist that by not participating in it.
Yes, we have one question online and 3 in the audience.
We'll take them together.
Yeah, I think that perhaps we then have you ask the questions together, and then Dr. Yangde can answer to them in the order that he likes. So the questions came in this particular order.
Thank you. Thanks, Serge, for bringing your work in this conversation here. I wanted to ask, given your international experience, if you have any suggestions on how to engage in a constructive conversation about inequities and elements of caste in this very equitable society. And I ask that question just out of love for this place that I'm very invested in and admire a lot, because it is so much better in terms of equity than many places in the world. And yet, in an everyday kind of context, we can look at who delivers our food. Even one of my daughters, one of her friends, my daughter has a friend who observed recently, Finnish girl, she said, why is it that all the people who deliver food have dark skin? Even a child could observe this discrepancy. Or say we had this Linnan Juhla recently, this celebration at the presidential palace down the street. I watched this extravaganza for 2 hours. I was like, are there no notable Roma architects, writers, scholars? Are there no Same, people who are outside of, say, the token few? Where are the refugees who are doing exemplary things? Could there be a Roma Alexander Stubb? Right? Very exemplary person, but he is from the traditional upper crust here. And this is a society where engaging in conversations like this can feel existentially threatening. It's a don't rock the boat society, given the history of civil war, given the shadow of Russia. There's this sense that we need to unify. So, long story short, how to engage in a constructive conversation about inequities in a don't rock the boat society, given the history and the context here.
Thank you so much for this excellent question. Here,
I'm wondering if you should answer that question first, because my topic is very different from, or should I just?
Go ahead.
Okay. First of all, thank you for your conversation. I'm a big fan of your work. I've heard your conversations with Anurag minus Varma as well in the past. So thank you for that. I have 2 different topics, but I think they kind of connect to each other. One of them, I'm Indian by the way, and one of the questions is, why is it that you think that a country having gone through colonization, and I'm also aware of the fact that when we went through colonization, it was a deal that was made with the Brahmins and the British in terms of how the power was shared in the society during colonization. But why is it that a society that was so oppressed as a whole is not able to empathize with the oppressed within its society that exists even today? Because they face the brunt of that, And I'm aware that I think Brahmins were probably still leading very good lives even during colonization, is what my assumption would be. That's number one. And the second question is that, given how India's current stance is on trying to accelerate its quote-unquote economic development at a very fast pace, how does that relate to, historically development has always gone hand in hand with genocidal intent or, extraction of the marginalized. How do those conflicting ideas emancipate from each other? Because the marginalized will always be marginalized if the country is trying to economically develop itself at the cost of labor, And in the Western countries, you see that labor being maybe migrants coming from other parts of the world. So it's always like this ladder effect where the minority is, there's always a minority to a majority somewhere. How does that relate to each other? Yeah, thank you.
Very good.
Okay, so here in the back, so good to.
Thank you. My name is Gutu. Thank you, Suraj, for a nice talk. I pose two questions very briefly. One has to do with the affirmative action you talked about the caste and quota system, which you seem to me as a critic of it. There are reasons to argue for it or against it in other settings as well. But again, to situate this, who is against this, for what this reason, in what context? And for example, some people argue for it, considering that it is a step as a way of rectifying historical injustices, right? What is the alternative? Myself, I struggle with this question when it comes from students as well. How shall we treat this quota affirmative action in a fair way as a person who struggles, or at least tries to become voice for discriminated people? The second question has to do with intersectionality, which you somehow alluded to in previous questions, answers. Class and caste intersecting at some point, and one of your works you referred to. Singling out caste as such would give us a better picture of what it is in and of itself, but then to see it in a broader context of multiple identities coming together, compounding discriminations as well as privileges, would probably become more comprehensive in terms of understanding the realities across the world. What would you reflect on that briefly? Thank you.
Thank you, Gutu. I think your question is related, right? It is related. I think the first question has alluded to the answer that your second question is, because I'm not critical of quota system as such, but I'm critical of looking at it only through one perspective. We need a composite approach to that. Or else what it does is it creates a society. For example, if you get rid of caste system, and if you have quotas on caste system, there's got to be something else that adds to that layer, so then we can go towards liberation, or else it will reiterate. So people will have to constantly identify with that caste system, because that's all it is. And that's been one of the bigger problems. And that's why intersectionality, or whatever, I have whatever the word means, right? But multiple anchors or axioms that works to making into a category, we can work with that. Class is one of that, of course. And for us to define a policy in any parts of the world, especially affirmative action like policies, it has to have an element of caste of that society. And caste is representative of your status, your class, your group, your ethnic background, and what it does in that society relating to others. It's not just caste as a one identity, it's composite of that. So the Indian caste system, for example, is that, but it eventually then became bereft of, if you look at caste system, like 89 or 93% of the people who are from the four most economically marginalized groups are belong to the Dalit and tribal groups, the indigenous Adivasi groups. So there's already is inclusive of that. But we cannot have that, that's why the whole middle class question becomes, because then you become assimilated into a system based on identity that give you access into that system. If you're a black person or whatever person, color or whatever, that give you access into that system. Now you have to hold on to that, because that's how you identify, that's how you check the box. Well, then how do we get rid of it? Then there is obviously a legitimate concern by the people who would refuse this. They say, you see now, we want to get rid of this, right? But you're still identifying people as this and that, and the left has no answer, or anybody has no answer. So that's what I'm saying. The policy of representation is important. The policy of occupying important positions of power is important. No denying that. But we have to go further into dismantling the structures. But if we create more people to be part of the system that reproduces that same hierarchy, it just becomes a formalized form of multiple oppression. That's why you will see colonial example. What's your name?
Samved.
Samved. That's what Samved says, like colonial oppression, right? It kind of We created a colonial artifacts of racialized colonialism, third world countries or white versus, and then what did we do? We gave a scot-free to people who are not white and dominating. We can't talk about post-colonialism today without having China in the focus, without having these major economies in focus, because that's this kind of colonialism we have. And so if you just give a one-way approach to a policy for redistribution, I think is a riskier part. And I think that's that's the problem, where the people who are oppressing are in the habit of oppressing. Caste teaches you, not just Indian caste, any caste society teaches you to harmonize hierarchy, to make sense of it, because you belong to a community, and what do they say? That's how it has been. We have not done it. My ancestors did it. You ask a question, I've not done it. So this kind of sense of not guilt, caste society never gives you a guilt. And that's this profound achievement of this caste system. You are not guilty. You find a reason, like Vibha meets people. It doesn't make you accomplice. It's like, I'm not doing anything wrong, but like this, And I think that's why the people who have been oppressing for some time, colonial experiment in India was just 90 years official. How can you surmount a civilization that has recorded evidence of few millennia into that 90-year small period? If you ask me, what is that, 90 years? But because it's the post-colonial moment and everybody was excited to do something, it had its time. But it will not have a long career. Post-colonial is going to die at some point. I think it's already dead. There's few scholars, because what are you going to do with it without really accounting to it? It's an important framework of studying societies, but it's not the only. And that's what it happened, right? And so, Thabo Mbeki, for example, one of the second after Nelson Mandela, he became the president of South Africa. His brother is Moletse Mbeki. He wrote a book, African Capitalism or something. And he talks about the elite Africans who were in this whole program of decolonization, recreated the same system of economic imbalance. Kenya is a great example. Like 48 ethnic communities. Indian is one of them, by the way, and people still laugh at it. And you look at Jomo Kenyatta, belong to one group. And the other tribes are like huge disagreement. So we can't talk also about Kenya as this Kenyan society. If you start engaging, spend some time, Arto may know, so many ethnic groups, they have their own communities. So there is this position. And oftentimes, this has become the meeting point of elites, where each elite from historical society, they have collaborated with each other. But not any longer. We have to resist that. We don't have to allow that. Because you had your time, and you did a terrible job at it. You did not do the kind of excellence that we could give good report card. And that's another thing. And I think that kind of goes in hand with the development model. You need a development, a historic. How do you develop a society? Tell me, the basic principle is exploitation of natural resources. There's no development that can go to say, we don't need any material minerals that can help us develop. Come on. Our iPhones will be dead. There's no cobalt. If there's no violence happening in Congo and Zambia, and it's a historic problem, it's a colonial problem. Or in India, Adivasi land, Adanis, for example, buffoons trying to take away the creating laws. That's why I'm saying nation state has to be challenged as an idea, not through Marxian lens. Marxists are like, let's subordinate, let's have a regulation. What do you do then? Create an own system, which again is going to be a problem. Let's work through the existing. That's what the Dalit movement and community teaches us. It's to capture the state power within the existing frameworks and then make the state to work for you. You can do that. And they've done that with example of Mayawati, the first Dalit woman, powerful figure. Do we even hear about Mayawati? She was ruling a state of 200 million. Show me any woman leader anywhere in the world that had representation ruling over 200 million people? Anywhere? We have people in New Zealand, we have people in England, Thatcher and all did terrible job. We have in few countries, but 200 million. Nowhere. And yet, we don't know about Mayawati. The magnum of democracy here, a Dalit woman. I had to write articles in her support. Only I had in this recent kind of times. Why not? Because there is a deep apathy. That there is this kind of, groundswell against this. And I was like, this Brahmin feminists, for example, let's do feminism, let's do intersectionality, and do what? Condemn a Dalit. That's the whole business of this intersectionality. The business that are running around, dominant caste woman, let's identify victim. Okay, wait a minute. Oh, that's the Dalit man. He's the victim. He is the perpetrator. He is the violent man. Let's find him. He is done wrong. He oppresses his woman. He does this. He does that. Without accounting to gender doesn't exist in silo in any system that is intrinsically endogamous in nature. You reproduce gender by becoming endogamous. Yet they teach the Dalit woman as well. Dalit man is a problem. Dalit man is a problem. Whole industry. Dalit man does this. Dalit man does do. Dalit man does. Yeah, it's not just Dalit man. It's the man doing it. What is Dalit about that man? In a gender hierarchy, man is patriarchal and he is imposing his own dictates upon a considered weaker generation, and that's what the man has been doing within this patriarchal framework that gives him advantage and has a scot-free approach. What is Dalit about this man? Does he have a power? Does the Dalit man have a power? You are the first victim when it comes the state or police attacking you. Who gets arrested? Who gets beaten up? The Dalit man. Why don't we account to that? Who is in jail? The Dalit or Adivasi man. Yet the singular approach of making this a gender or intersectional position really victimizes the already victim. It doesn't mean that the Dalit man doesn't create a problem. He is as much part of a patriarchal, sexist society as other men. But by singling out the Brahmin woman, and I've had these conversations with many times, and I always tell Brahmin women, unless and until your resistance against patriarchy starts with dismantling your own family that is made of caste structures, you have no moral authority to come and tutor us on how to liberate women. The anti-caste struggle itself is part of it. It is bringing that out with all its limitations. It's not perfect. You have to go there. But how do we register that? And that approach is coming from deep resentment against what constitutes a body which is male or female. We have not even talked about misgendered bodies that operate amidst us. The concern for that is not even existing. They will use it. The Dalit man is this. But what about many people who are not even part of the gender identity? How do you fit that? There is this whole notion of why do we have a approach of hierarchy where you are a person, father, blah, 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 and then comes the lower woman. And yet we haven't seen yet Brahmin women groups fighting against caste. There is no organization led by Brahmin women that I'm aware of that is against caste. You may have white women in America fighting against race or color, whatnot. We don't have Brahmin women doing that. And they come and tell our women, Dalit man is the problem. And our women spend more time thinking that the easiest target is the guy who's at home, or our father, or our brother, or relative. Let's beat him first. Fight against the system. Why? You will not, because there is no solidarity among Brahmin women and Dalit women. And the solidarity only becomes where it is congenial and benefiting the Brahmin woman. Dalit women will never benefit out of that. I think this goes to kind of thinking about what marginalization means. Like Kavita's question about color. I was so surprised to learn that child is registering the color. I thought color is taught. Looking at race is taught. But if a child is registering that, I mean the system is teaching. If the child is finished. We've seen all these examples of difference, how it manifests. And I think it has to do with culture. My reading is, and I've read very little about Finnish society. I was looking at Sami people's population. They're like 10,000 people. At least in Finland, that's what the record I got. And yet Finnish society is concerned about them. May they be more concerned about them? I was like, there is something ethical about it. It may not be the perfect society, but a group that is significant in number, which constitutes minority. If you look at 5 million, there are 10,000 people. Numerically, for an Indian sense, that doesn't even exist. Because the largest constituency, one member of parliament in Telangana is half your population. 4 or 5 MPs will get the same votes together that will constitute 5 million people here. So if Finland votes together, we will send maybe 5 MPs to Indian parliament. That's the kind of big number I'm talking about. That doesn't register as that. But the problem remains. What do we do with these new ideas of new bodies coming as resistance? We can't claim this neutrality in any society that is deep-seated with problems that are not neutral. Politically neutral, you may want to do some economic relations and have a protection of that. We may understand that. But in everyday interactions, you can't afford to be neutral because you are not neutral. You are choosing a position not to act on it. And not willing to act on it really says something. But I think the immigration question is going to be a big problem. I don't know how big it is going to be in Finland, but it's really going to change the graph. It's really going to explain the unexplainable. Zizek made a comment some time ago and he was berated by the unemployed left. That Zizek said, you have to learn the local language and be part of assimilate and stuff. And they were like, oh, how can you do that? Let me tell you, man. The same opposite, like for example, the people who will, and I'm talking about the South Asian context, right? Very inhospitable people. They will only write, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. We are very welcoming. Do you welcome a toilet cleaner in your house? Or do you welcome a maid who's cooking in your house? In the same? No, it doesn't work. But we expect the same policies to replicate. And I think this is where we have to really learn from societies that are themselves grappling. Finland, in its sense, modern democratic nation is new. It's few people. And I think it may provide us. But it cannot provide us a model. Indians love to look at Finland and you look at it like, how will you do this? It's always good to think about it. It's always good to imagine about it. But you can't do it. And I'm not saying pessimistically, I'm just saying realistically. How will you do it? The Delhi government, the Mania government of Kejriwal wanted to do, let's do something, finish, send the commission. It's good, great attempt, nothing wrong with that. How do you do it? How do we really implement? Unless and until we look at society is constituting itself based on how we recognize other, not the way they were to recognize, but the way we were to recognize them. And that's the big difference. I don't know much about Finnish society, but I really think, at least on this level of parity, when it comes to certain economic measures, schooling and all, is exceedingly superior. From where I come, compared to where I come, looks superior. It may have its own problems, which every society has. But if there remains a resistance within a community, it has to acknowledge. It cannot claim that it's one of the most perfect, uber replicable society. And I think that resistance coming from the pockets of minorities or groups who stand still or against the state becomes part of a new democracy that emerges out of it. Or else we'll just have this kosher democracy. And I mean it intentionally, the word kosher. We will never be able to self-sanitize. And I think that's why let's grapple with this question. Let's look at how caste-like societies are forming here. Let's see where do we find ourselves properly located. And maybe there can be much more interactions between these diverse societies that are not just geopolitically connected. Because geopolitics is, again, let me tell you, you all know this, it's always about economic relations. It's not about people. That's just a side hustle they want to do. That's just like exchange students and stuff like that, or going cultural initiatives. But the priority is for any sovereign state to have economic models. And unless and until we focus our attention on that, our struggle is only going to be very limited. This whole representation, affirmative action, quotas, having that touches a very tiny slice of that, which is very important. I'm not saying it's unimportant, but the bigger stakes are somewhere else. And I think we have to have focus on that. And maybe the Dalit movement may help us figure some of this thing out as we go in the process and learn. It's not a final answer, but it's a communication. Thank you.
Nita, would you like to say about the book?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for your talk. It was very insightful. Yeah, but regarding the books, so we had like 10 pieces, and if you want to buy it, we are gonna do it like you can send it to me, like on my mobile pay, but I will then send it collectively to Suraj. And did you decide on the price?
Wherever. What do you say?
On this price, is it the one?
Yeah,
this
it's
one?
yeah.
So for 34 euros, right? Yeah, so it will be 34 euros, and you can pay me on mobile pay to get it.
So I recommend you can get a signed copy from our prestigious, wonderful keynote speaker for today. So let's give a big applause to someone.
And to the online people as well. The people are online, thank you.
I think there was a couple of more questions, but we have now.
We'll wait another day.